It's live. Welcome. Before we begin tonight, I want to announce the Holladay Historical Commission's latest project. That's this. We've chosen 10 buildings in Holladay, researched and provided photos on a document that people will be able to access on this code. So there will be a number in front of the house, and then you'll be able to look at the document that you pull up. And actually, out on the front table, there are little maps of, it's kind of a giant loop that you can take, and there are 10 homes on it. So that's that. And then, just quickly, tonight is the 7th lecture in our speaker series. We've heard from Holladay's first mayor, Leanne Stillman. We've heard from Alan Roberts about what is unique about Holladay. We've heard from the State Historical Preservation Office telling us how to get a house on the National Register. We heard from David Hammett. There he is. Talking about the Grand Estates of Holladay and Mill Creek. Forrest Kutch, a Native American scholar, came here a couple of months ago to tell us about who lived here before the white settlers came. And then we had Kathy Osborne from the Holladay Cemetery talking about the families that founded Holladay and are still here down the street in the cemetery. So tonight we have Ben Oliver. Ben is the former director of the Utah Main Street program, he says, decades ago, and has provided consulting services in historic preservation and economic development. He's written and conducted studies on Utah architecture for decades with a focus on the 20th century. Now he turns his attention to Holladay, one of Utah's oldest communities, but where most of the development occurred in the decades following World War II. Welcome.
Thank you, Kim. Thanks, everybody, for attending this evening. I wanted to ask, before we begin, are there any members of the City Council here this evening? Mayor? Okay, so we can kind of say whatever we want, is that right? I mean, I know this is being recorded, so we'll kind of temper it a little bit. Okay, I'm going to give this a shot, see if this works. Here we go. So I've done a lot of presentations, and somehow technology always gets you. You're never quite sure. How many of you play golf? Wow, there are no golfers here. You do play golf. So here's the rule of golf that I've learned, is that some part of your game will not accompany you to the course. You're just never sure what it is, okay? Same is true here. Can you advance it for me, please? Thank you. So before I launch into my presentation, I want to introduce Adrienne White, because I think you'll be interested in her business, especially if you're interested in learning about the story of your own home. So I'm going to turn this over to Adrienne.
Thank you so much. Oh. Okay. First, I want to thank you all so much for being here, and especially thank you to Ben for allowing me the opportunity to speak to you. So my name is Adrienne White. I am the founder and CEO of House Genealogy, where I research historic homes and the people who lived in them. It was all born out of me purchasing my own historic home in the Sugar House area, researching my home and falling in love with the process of really creating a narrative around the people that have lived in my home and the things that they experienced throughout their lives. So, and here's my contact information if you want to write it down. And then, can you go to the next slide? Thank you. So when I first started the business, I thought that I would be exclusively working with homeowners like me who are just curious about all of the previous residents. But over the course of the past year or so, I have worked with a variety of people and organizations. In terms of my clients, I work with homeowners, and I've actually worked with some businesses who run their businesses out of historic homes, such as the Ellerbeck, which is a bed and breakfast in the Avenues, and then the historic Sugar House Work Hive. It was a building that was going to be demolished. It was saved and then turned into a co-working space on 21st South. I've also worked with developers who have saved buildings from being demolished, and they're getting historic tax credits to develop in that area while preserving the historic buildings. So that's just a little bit about me. Outside of my business, I'm also involved in Preservation Utah. I'm on the Historic Properties Committee. We have actually, and I'm sure Ben is going to mention this, but we have our Historic Home Store coming up this Saturday on the 20th from 10 to 4. So what? Yeah. So we're both, are you going to be there? Okay, so we're both going to be there. It's going to be really great. I'm going to be a house manager for one of the houses. It's going to be in the Federal Heights neighborhood, which I'm sure you know is just a stunning, stunning part of the city. So if you are free this Saturday, please come. It's an opportunity for you to not only see some incredible houses, but to also provide some fundraising for an organization that needs it. Outside of my involvement in Preservation Utah, I'm also the preservation coordinator, historic preservation coordinator for Wasatch Mountain Club, which is an organization that has been around for over 100 years. So if you've never heard of it, it's an outdoor recreation organization, and they actually have tons and tons and tons of materials at the Marriott Library, and I kind of help get that organized so that we can all consume it and enjoy it. And then lastly, I'm also on the Sugar House Community Council as a board of trustees. So I like to give back to my community. So if there are any other opportunities for me to get involved in the Holladay community or any other communities that you're involved in, I would love to chat with you after the meeting. And again, thank you so much for the opportunity to tell you a little bit about me and what I'm doing in Salt Lake. Thank you so much.
So I've had a chance to see Adrian's work, and it's really impressive. And if you have any interest in when your house was built, who might have built it, who might have lived there, you really ought to contact her because she does tremendous work. I don't get a commission for that either. All right, let's see what happens now. Oh, okay. So I have to say I stopped at Layla for a bite to eat on the way over. And they sat me at the bar, which I thought was a little presumptuous. But I was sitting there eating, and a couple of people sat down next to me, and they knew the server. And so they were chatting. She said, "Oh, what are you going to do this evening?" They said, "Well, we're going to go to the gym." And I really thought she was going to say, "Well, aren't you going to go to that presentation by Ben Oliver?" But I was somewhat disappointed that she did not. So we are going to talk this evening about the significance of Holladay's post-war architecture, post-World War II. Thank you. Now I'm not sure whether the remote controls the machine or whether it controls Holly. We'll see what happens as the evening goes on. I wanted to speak about the significance of Holladay's post-war architecture because most of the growth in Holladay, as we're going to see, and as you probably already know, occurred after World War II. And the post-war architecture of Holladay is therefore really its defining architectural element. So it's important to understand what it is and understand its significance. Oops, I want to go back. Sorry. Thank you. So what we're going to talk about this evening is what buildings look like before World War II, because I believe that many of us have a predisposition to think of a building as historic if it was built before, say, 1940. And I'm here to kind of change that perception if I can. We're going to talk about the post-war suburban styles that were prevalent here. Then we're going to focus a little bit on modernism in Holladay because I'll say this now and I'm going to say it again. I believe Holladay has a greater concentration of significant modernist houses than any other community in the state. It's really significant. It surprised me when I did my research. I'm going to talk a little bit about what all this means, and then we're going to come to a couple of recommendations that I have that I actually didn't anticipate making until I put this presentation together. Thank you. Did you do that? Okay, thank you. Well, I was going to make a comment about the remote control in my wife, but I won't do that. Probably. And in fact, I hope she doesn't see this. So we're going to talk about what buildings looked like before World War II because, as I mentioned, I believe a lot of us have a perception of a building as historic if it was constructed before World War II. And why that's significant here is that if you have that perception, it's going to influence whether you think the post-war architecture is significant. And again, I'm here to, I hope, change that perception. And in fact, when we come to the end of the presentation, I'm going to talk a little bit about the challenges associated with Holladay's post-war architecture and what it might mean to the community. So these are a couple of houses from Holladay. They look historic because they are historic. They look and feel, I would say, quaint. And I think if I were to use the term, if I were to say to you, historic house, what would jump in your mind is something that looks like this. Not all the historic buildings in Holladay, of course, were or are houses. This is the Oakwood School. Did anybody go to school in the Oakwood School? You did. Did you stay awake the whole time? Oh, okay. All right. Well, since I don't know you, I'll say, yes, that must be true. This is the Oakwood School in the upper left, and in the lower right is the big Cottonwood Ward. Is that building still standing? It is not. Neither of these buildings are standing then, or is standing. But these, again, are different types of buildings that we think of as historic. Thank you. And these are commercial buildings from old Holladay. The upper building is much more typical of a typical downtown commercial building from the turn of the 20th century. It's much more common in a downtown, and I'll come back to that issue in just a minute. But the lower one is also kind of a common commercial building, again, from the late 1800s and into the early 20th century. But these are the buildings that we think of as historic. So put those in your brain, keep those there, because we're going to come back to them indirectly later in the presentation. Thank you. Okay. You know, this actually is kind of cool because I don't know what's coming next. And if I don't know what's coming next, you really don't know what's coming next. So the suspense is killing you. So this, Holladay in my mind is a post-war suburban community. Now, I think the term suburban for many people is maybe not entirely positive. And when we get to looking at some of the suburban homes that I'm going to mention, sometimes I'll talk to people and I'll say, where did you grow up? Well, I grew up in one of those little suburban homes. It's like they're sort of ashamed of growing up in a house like that. They're great homes. They really are. And as we're going to see, they're also significant. But I want to explain why I think Holladay is a post-war suburban community. Thank you. First of all, the primary growth in Holladay occurred after World War II, or has occurred after World War II. This graph in the lower part of the slide is a graph that I borrowed from Holladay Cottonwood, Places and Faces, edited by Stephen Carr. And he acknowledges in presenting this graph that most of these numbers here are best guesses because there wasn't a census for Holladay. The first one I ran across was for 1970, and since Holladay wasn't incorporated in 1970, I'm not quite sure what area it would cover. Having said that, these numbers, I think, give us a sense of scale. They give us a sense of the pace of growth. And if you look, I don't know if you can see the numbers at the bottom. You don't have to. Where the curve goes up real fast, that's post-World War II. So there was a lot of population growth. Holladay also had large lots. It actually had large plots of land. There were farms here. It wasn't obviously developed before World War II. So there was a lot of space in which to develop. Holladay didn't have a downtown. It never has had a downtown. A traditional downtown has a number of commercial buildings that look like the ones we saw earlier that are densely placed together. It has a mix of uses, and neither of those situations, neither of those conditions was present in Holladay. So they never really had a downtown. There is a center, there's a commercial center at the intersection of Murray Holladay Road and Holladay Boulevard, and I can't remember what it's called. There is a name for it, isn't there? That's Holladay Village. Thank you very much. Yeah. So Does she deserve a raise or what? She's got to put up with me all night, I tell you. Okay. Holladay is defined by dispersed development. In other words, it's spread out. It's not concentrated. I live in Sugar House. If you drive through Sugar House, it's dense. The houses are close together. If you go into downtown Sugar House, the buildings are close together. It's a densely constructed area. Holladay is not like that. Holladay has curvilinear streets. Keep that one in your brain, okay? I'm going to throw a couple of other terms at you this evening that you can take home with you to impress your spouse. Okay, and this is one of them, curvilinear. Holladay was not platted on a grid like, say, Salt Lake City, right? And there's a reason for curvilinear streets. One of the reasons is, as Alan Roberts pointed out in his presentation, the topography here is particular, if you will. And so the layout of streets becomes a little more challenging. The other reason, though, that's more to this suburban point is that suburban developers after World War II believed that curvy streets gave their subdivisions a more rural character. So you felt like you were more, if you were winding your way home, that feels more like you're out in the country than if you're driving down a straight street. And finally, Holladay is defined by its suburban building types and styles, and we will get to that. Thank you. In fact, we can go ahead and forward through this one. Thank you. So we're going to talk first about suburban commercial buildings. How many of you, I was going to ask, how many of you stole some candy from the Success Market? But I don't think we want to go through that this evening. So what I will ask is, how many of you shopped in this building? How many of you went to the market in this building? This is, boy, you've done everything, haven't you? Yeah. This is very much of this period. It was constructed in the early 1950s. By this time, the primary materials of commercial development were steel and concrete and glass, and that's what this building is. It's streamlined. It doesn't look like those commercial buildings that we looked at earlier at all. Unfortunately, this building is no longer there, but it does represent the architecture, the commercial architecture of this post-war, certainly the early post-war period.
I'm sorry, where was that building?
This was, okay, go ahead. You know, if you get up, you have to take this.
No, okay, go ahead. Holladay Boulevard, Lady Avenue. Okay.
You have that? So I believe you would say, okay, let me see if I get this correct. It was on the northwest corner of Murray Holladay Road and Holladay Boulevard, that intersection. Is that correct? Northwest corner?
The northwest?
That's where Holladay Village is.
Yeah. This would, yeah.
Area 27 is kind of down right here.
Oh, okay. All right. All right.
Video burn from it?
Yes.
Okay. Okay, so how many of you stole a video from Video Games? Yes. Okay. All right. So here are a couple of rather simple commercial buildings from the post-war period. One reason that you see these buildings as geometric is because of those materials. Steel in particular. Steel is straight, so you get geometric forms, geometric shapes out of it. Lots of glass. Fairly simple, though. There's not a lot going on with these buildings. The upper one is there still. It's on the very southern boundary of Holladay. The lower one, Tracy Collins, is also there, but you wouldn't know it. It's been heavily remodeled, and we're going to come back to that at the end as well. So this is Holladay's downtown. It's its commercial center in the 1970s, and the architecture and the configuration, if you will, of this space is very much of the post-war period. This is typical suburban commercial development. It is not at all like a traditional downtown. And you can see some of the buildings here. They're low slung. They're fairly simple in design. This set of photos to me is really significant. And that is a point I'm going to come back to at the end. So I'm holding you, most of this stuff's going to come at the end. So, retain some energy because I'm going to throw a lot of stuff at you in the last 5 minutes. Okay. But the most significant commercial development, of course, was Cottonwood Mall. It was constructed in the early 1960s. It was the first shopping mall in Utah. And for that reason, it probably could have been nominated to the National Register of Historic Places if it were still standing. So when you look at this building, when you look at Cottonwood Mall, how many of you think, well, that's not historic, right? It doesn't look historic at all, but it probably would have been considered significant. So for that reason, I would stipulate that the Macy's building is significant, that it actually is both architecturally and historically significant to the community of Holladay. How many of you look at the Macy's building and go, oh, that is just so beautiful? Nobody, right? And that's a key point to think about. When we think about buildings that are historic, we have to remember historicity is not about beauty. It's about other elements, other attributes of a building. Okay, we're going to talk about Holladay's suburban educational architecture. This, of course, is Olympus High School. How many of you went to Olympus High School? And you graduated with distinction, right? How many? Yes. Yeah. We'll just assume that's the case. Again, you see kind of a certain kind of shape that is becoming more sort of typical of this architecture, any of this suburban architecture, which is straight lines and right angles, because again, we're using steel and glass and concrete. One of the things I had done a presentation about modernism, and I actually used the Union High School in Ballard, Utah as an example. And it was interesting to me because when I read about that particular building, what I learned was that school planners in Ballard, Utah found out, hey, if we buy more land and stretch the building out, it's going to be cheaper to build a new school than if we build a school like, say, Oakwood School. So what you see in these suburban schools is a sort of an extended horizontal profile, as with this building. This is Morningside Elementary. Again, it's got this extended profile that stretches out, and I believe that's because it's cheaper to buy, Holladay after World War II, there's a lot of land, and it's cheaper to buy land and build a stretched out building than it is to build a vertical building. One of the things that's really cool, I'm going to walk over here and yell at you, okay? I want you to look. Might be hard to see, but you see these elements here? These are panelized window systems. They were highly popular in the 50s and 60s. So you get a window, this is called a spandrel, this element below the window. You get these, they come as units, and you just kind of plop them into place. They're really pretty commonplace in this period of architecture, especially in institutional architecture. And then there's this really cool canopy here, which is probably aluminum. This awning here, really beautiful awning that provides for shading for the school. So, this in particular kind of hints at a little bit of modernism in the design of the school. Thank you. Okay. In fact, we can go through this slide. I'm sorry to impose on you here like that. So now we're going to talk about suburban residential architecture. These buildings represent early post-war suburban architecture in Holladay. They are small. The footprint of the upper building is about 900 square feet, and we packed, 5 or 6 rooms into that space? Can you imagine mom and dad, there's just no place to go, right? But they're really neat little homes. The thing is, they don't have the same feeling of quaintness that those early buildings did. They don't have that sort of same quality that kind of speaks to us of historic. And yet, they might well be. They might well be significant because of what they represent in Holladay's evolution. So, a couple of things happened after World War II. Now you're going, what is that slide doing there? A couple of things happened after World War II. Families grew, right? We have the baby boomer period, and incomes grew. This has been called the golden age of consumerism. And in fact, it's really the period in which America's economy started to shift toward consumer spending. If you listen to economic news, it's all about consumer spending. Well, this is kind of when it happened. This is the ultimate consumerist family. In fact, they're so good at it that dad has an extra motor that he carries around with him wherever he goes. All right? But this sort of exuberance is going to influence post-war architecture, post-war suburban architecture. So these are a couple of homes in Holladay that reflect the change that's occurring as a result of this, I'll say, exuberance. This type and style of house is called a modern ranch house. There are lots of variations on it here in Holladay and across the country. It was highly popular after World War II. It came out of California. It was based in the vernacular architecture of California, specifically the hacienda. So these are low-slung. They're relatively simple. They're not very ornate, typically, although we'll see some changes in just a minute. And they include one key element, and that is the attached garage. That became an essential ingredient of much of post-war still today. In fact, in many ways, the garage has become a prominent feature on many new homes. But these are the modern ranch house. I guess that's not correct, is it? These are modern ranch houses. How about any English teachers in the room? Okay, good. All right. Well, the modern ranch house grew larger, but it also grew stylistically. If you think about those two homes we looked at earlier, they're fairly simple. I would say they're fairly plain. That's not a criticism by any means. They're just simple homes. They're simple designs. They're not ornate. But there was, I think, a desire to start to create homes that looked like they were something in the country, that felt kind of rural. Remember, suburban developers felt that they were trying to communicate a rural character to their subdivisions. So we have these homes that incorporate natural materials like stone and wood, and it's really hard to see. I'm going to walk over here. You can see these diamond panes in the window. So as I was kind of going through this presentation, I was thinking, how do I describe this particular style of modern ranch? And the only word I could come up with was cottagization. Okay? They're made to look like country cottages, right? They're not, but they're made to look like country cottages. So you have this more stylized approach to this basic house type. And again, I'll say there are lots of variations on this theme in Holladay. And I just don't have the time to go through all of them this evening. There are also derivations of the ranch house in Holladay. A couple of prime examples are the split level and the split entry. These homes appeared a little bit later, and they were really a way to kind of obviously add more space to the basic modern ranch house. One other element of the modern ranch house that I failed to mention that we didn't see in the images is an essential ingredient of that house type. It is the patio. We started to incorporate outside living into the design of homes. Now, that makes a lot of sense in Laguna Beach. Maybe not so much in Salt Lake City in February, but that was still an essential ingredient of the modern ranch house. Well, so you may have looked at these images and you may have thought, okay, those are nice, but they don't really strike me as being particularly significant architecturally. Well, here's my rebuttal. In 1947, Sunset Magazine, which was the magazine of Western living, published an entire book about this house type. Sunset Western Ranch Houses. It's a beautiful publication. I mean, it's not like they slapped it together. It's absolutely beautiful. And so if Sunset Magazine, the magazine of Western living, felt that it was significant enough to produce this high-quality, glossy publication, then that house type must have had some real value to them, and it should have real value to us today as well. I'm going to take a short break and ask if there are any questions or comments at this point. Okay, then I'm going to ask you, can I roll up my sleeves? Okay, it's kind of warm in here. Let's see. I'll push this. Oh, how about that? That went on its own, didn't it? Wow, that surprised me. Let's see if it works again. Wow, look at that. Okay, while I roll up my sleeves, it makes me think of, remember Rocky and Bullwinkle? And Bill Winkle would roll up his sleeves, going, nothing up my sleeves. Okay, thank you for your indulgence. Okay, so we're going to talk about modernism in Holladay. And before we do that, I want to answer the question, what is modernism? Because I think for many people, modernism as an architectural term is something of a mystery. It might mean kind of just about anything. So I want us to have a shared set of values, if you will, about what we're going to look at and what modernism means. Modernism as an architectural style came out of Europe. It entered the United States in the early 1930s. It was a response by some European architects to what they considered to be the excesses in European architecture at the end of the 19th century. In fact, American architect Philip Johnson, who was responsible for bringing European modernism to the U.S., once called this style of architecture the chaos of eclecticism. So there was a little bit of everything going on. You could put a flamingo on, you could put a cherub on, you could put a star on. In fact, put more of that on. That was the chaos of eclecticism. That was the style of architecture that certain architects in Europe were responding to. And they produced architecture that looked like this. It was radically different, needless to say. If you think of any grand European building at the end of the 19th century, it didn't look like this. The three buildings here were designed by probably the most significant early modernist architects. In the upper left is the Weissenhof home designed by Le Corbusier. In the upper right is the Bauhaus building designed by Walter Gropius. And in the lower image is the Villa Tugendhat designed by Mies van der Rohe. And these buildings share certain qualities. They celebrate modern materials. They celebrate steel and concrete and glass. They want you to see them as part of the construction. They're geometric. In fact, here's another word you can take home with you. Remember curvilinear? Remember that one? You're going to take that home? Here's another one. You're going to take home rectilinear. Okay? Don't get them confused. You can't say curved or recta, because that's not going to work very well. Rectilinear, right angles. These are defined by right angles, straight lines and right angles. In part because of the materials that they were working with, steel in particular, but also because they wanted to return architecture to its essential forms, to its essential shapes. They felt like the chaos of eclecticism had led us astray. So we want to have essential forms. Typically, these buildings were white or relatively flat in color because what these architects were striving for was a planar surface, a flat surface. They wanted that to be pure as well. And finally, there was little or no applied ornamentation. The ornament that these architects were displaying was in the design and construction of the building, not in any kind of applied ornamentation. If you look in particular at the Villa Tugendhat in the lower image, you can see it displays another aspect of modernism that we commonly see, and that is abstraction. We're pulling the building apart and we're putting it back together again. It's not a single box. That's a very common element in modernism. We're going to see that again in some examples from Holladay. So we're going to start with commercial modernism. And we're going to start with this building that rather unfortunately is no longer there. This is the Regus Medicus. It was designed by John Sugden, who was definitely one of the most significant post-war architects in Utah, and perhaps in the history of the state. And this displays another element of modernism that we haven't talked about yet, and that is the expression of structure. What that means is, if you look at this, it might be a little hard to see in the image, but you'll see these steel triangles that are kind of parading across the front of the building. That's the structure of the building. We want to see that. We don't want to cover it with something else. We want to express it. And you see, of course, lots of glass behind the structure. This is, to me, an extraordinarily beautiful building in its simplicity. It's just absolutely, if you like geometry, man, you love this building. And I really think it's an absolutely beautiful building. Again, unfortunately, it has been demolished. Now, this building is super cool, okay? But it displays an aspect of modernism in the evolution of thinking about modernism. A lot of people in the United States didn't really warm up to those ideas that we saw in that first picture of modernism with those three buildings They felt that that was kind of cold, kind of austere, kind of off-putting. So what happened was, as modernism migrated across the country, it began to be adapted. And one of the more significant adaptations was the incorporation of natural materials. So you see that beautiful stone wall there on the left. I'll point it out. You know, I went for a bike ride today. Why did they do that? Keep going back and forth. Here's the stone wall. Isn't that beautiful? The texture in that wall. Now, that would have been problematic for our early modernists because, again, they wanted that pure flat surface. But we're creating texture now. And if you look at the slope of the roof, this gentle sloping roof, I think this is an absolutely beautiful building. And again, in my mind, it might be eligible for the National Register of Historic Places, in part because there are so few buildings from this period in Holladay, so few commercial buildings. But it also represents this kind of evolution of architecture. It's rather unfortunate that that somewhat sad tree is right in the middle of the image. It would, be nice if we could kind of get that out of there, but don't let that influence your thinking about the beauty of the building. We have a building type that appears in Holladay after World War II that I don't believe existed in Holladay prior to World War II, and that is the office building. Now, these are a couple of late modernist office buildings on Highland Drive. And again, we're trying to create a modernist feel, but be a little less hard edge. So you see in the upper left, the building in the upper left has this facade that's been kind of attached or tacked onto the front, simply as a decorative device. It's not there, it's not meant to be functional in any way. It's just there to kind of add a little character to the building, a little visual character. And you can't see it very well in the image, but the building has rounded corners as well. That was very hip in the 80s. In the lower image, this building has a lot of glass, which was very popular in this late period, 70s and 80s. What's really cool, I'm going to point something out again. Look here, the windows are projecting from the building. There's this sculptural quality to these windows that I think is really beautiful. It's a really cool building. And there aren't very many of these in Holladay either. Not very many of these in Holladay at all. Okay, here we go. So I ran across this building and I went, whoa, dude. That's kind of what I thought when I saw this building, because it completely defies any description that you can give it. I believe it would fall into the category of what's called Googie architecture, which was kind of futuristic modernism. That was very popular. It was, mostly you see it in things like drive-ins, like McDonald's and buildings like that. But this sort of feels like it wants to lift off and go to another reality, right? And I was taking this photo. You might be able to see in the lower right, there's a guy getting out of his car. This was on a Sunday, so I thought, office building Sunday, guy getting in the, what's going on here? But I didn't want to probe too deeply. But I did want to ask him, hey, what do you know about this building? And then I thought, that would be kind of weird. Walk up to some stranger, walks up and says, hey, what do you know about this building? I researched this building intensively because it was so intriguing to me, and I really couldn't find out much about it. And therein lies a key point of this entire evening. And I'll come back to that at the end. All right, we have educational modernism. Here are a couple of grade schools. Anybody go to either one of these? Driggs Elementary. Did you go to Driggs? Yeah. Yeah. And you graduated with distinction. Yeah, you didn't even care at that point because you were just so, yeah. Well, Driggs Elementary has this really beautiful line to it. And if you can see those concrete beams or columns that come up and they cantilever out from the building. Just a beautiful set of lines, very subtle. And that's a key element in my mind of viewing modernist buildings. You got to kind of look at them sometimes. Sure, there's an immediate reaction to them, but sometimes they ask you to look a little more. The other element of this building that's really cool are these colored panels that are in each bay here. And you can see just above is what's called a clear story window. Hey, you know what? I'm going to do something. I have an idea. I'm going to use my pointer. How about that? I'm going to use this. Okay? All right, so let's see if this works. It doesn't work on the screen for some reason.
Yeah,
Okay.
it was on the east side.
You what? Well, it's up there, but it doesn't show down here. Oh, well. Take it back. Okay. Well, and in the lower image, of course, is Spring Lane Elementary. Now, there's an element of determining a building's significance that is sometimes less obvious to people. Perhaps it's less immediately apparent. And that is a building can be considered significant simply because of who designed it. It doesn't necessarily have to, in and of itself, be architecturally significant, although I think this building is Spring Lane Elementary. I think they both are. But I think Spring Lane is because, number one, it was a school of this period, and number two, because it represents this particular evolution of modernist design. But more significant, more pertinent, I guess, to this particular building is the fact that it was designed by Edwards and Daniels, one of the most significant. Your jaw dropped at that. Well, thank you for that. That was quite dramatic. Edwards and Daniels, one of the most significant firms in Utah architectural history. They designed, among other things, the Salt Lake Public Library that is now the Leonardo. But it's really a wonderful building. I would love to go to school there. I love the little decorative element up above the entry there.
My daughter tells me to just close the school.
Yeah, that's what we were talking about. So that's something we're going to come back to at the end, but thank you for that. Yeah. This is Bonneville Junior High School, and this is also significant. Actually, this is the one that was designed by Edwards and Daniels. I apologize, but I couldn't really find many images of this building, and I ran across this black and white image. Did anybody go to school here? You did? David, of course, valedictorian, right?
At least
Yeah, but. Okay, so you can comment. So is this the entry in the lower image? Is that where you would walk into school?
You could enter it through various points.
Okay.
Two entries there.
Yeah.
This was
It's kind of,
courtyard and they had the lunchroom.
okay, so kind of an outside space too. Okay. So, okay. All right, thank you. Well, this is an example of educational modernism in Holladay, again, designed by a significant architectural firm. And I should say, as an aside, when I was doing my research, I wanted to find out about these schools, and I contacted Granite School District, and they were really responsive to me, and somebody wrote this phenomenal history of the school district. You should have it in your Holladay library, because there are schools here that are part of that district. It's really an extraordinary piece of work. Quite frankly, I was stunned. I thought, well, maybe they'll get back to me, and they sent me this beautiful, phenomenal history. This is the St. Vincent de Paul School, designed by Will Louis, one of our great Utah architects, a partner in Scott Louis and Browning. Will Louis. Which building is it? Will Louis. And it's a beautiful, I love the lines of this building. I love the gentle slope of the roof, and then this contrasting stone. Again, you see a lot of stone entering the picture here now. And then the material on either side of the stone panel, which is probably some kind of glass material that is translucent. It's really a wonderful, gentle kind of design, but very modernist in its basic ideas. This is the Holladay Library, and I included this in education because I think every once in a while we get educated in the library if we really want to try. This was also designed by Will Louis, and the upper image is the building as it was originally constructed. The lower image is the building as it was recently remodeled. And it points to a significant issue in my mind about Holladay's post-war architecture. And that is this. The design of the remodel is cool. It's sparkly. It's wonderful. But it has really nothing to do with the original design. It doesn't respect the original design. And I think as a result, it compromises the original design. And you can do the things that were supposed to be done here. You can achieve the goals that were supposed to be achieved in the redesign and still respect the original design. But look at this. If you look at this, we talked about abstraction. We talked about buildings that were kind of pulled apart and put back together again. I mean, it's just a beautiful composition, if you will, by Will Louis. And he had really in mind a couple of goals. One was to fit it into the residential character of the area, and the other was to, play off of the mountains, the views into the mountains. Really a wonderful building. And again, it's a great example of maybe we need to think hard about what we're doing when we remodel the building. Thank you. You can skip through that one because I think, thank you. One of the things that surprised me quite a bit was how much religious modernist architecture there is in Holladay and how many really cool churches there are here. This is the United Church of Christ. It was constructed in the mid-1950s. It was really kind of a celebration for the congregation because it actually had been two congregations until this church was constructed. What's really remarkable, and actually the original structure is this kind of A-frame building kind of towards the back of that upper photograph. It's interesting to me because that A-frame concept was kind of popular in religious architecture at the time. And I think I understand why, because if you look at the lower image, look at what you're looking at if you're listening to the pastor, articulating his or her sermon. You're looking at this incredible view. And in fact, if I were the pastor in this church, I'd be wondering, are people really paying attention to me? It's just an absolutely beautiful design. This is the Prophet Elias Greek Orthodox Church. If you can picture the Greek Orthodox Church in downtown Salt Lake on 3rd South and 3rd West, which is a traditional Greek Orthodox church, this ain't that, right? I'm actually currently working on a book about why buildings look the way they do. And I always want to ask, when I do this kind of research, I wish, I could sit down with the architect and say, what was the thinking behind this building, right? What were you thinking about with this design? Because clearly, it's unlikely that the congregation said to the architect, go nuts, right? They probably didn't do that. So there's some sense among the congregation members of what they want this building to look like. And that to me is kind of a key element in this religious modernism section, in that these buildings aren't necessarily modernist per se. They don't really follow those basic principles we talked about. What makes them modernist in my mind is that one of the things that modernism accomplished is that it kind of liberated architects from the traditional ways of thinking about building and designing. So we could design churches like this. It's really a cool church. Thank you. I had to show this because I ran across it in my research and I thought, this is just so cool. If there's anything that religion should do for an individual, it's to instill joy, right? It's to instill a sense of just sort of an uplifting quality. Look at how happy these people are about the fact that their new church is going to be constructed on this site. I just think it's a wonderful image. Back sort of more mundane point is, if you look behind these people, you'll see what? A whole lot of open space. There's a whole lot of land there. This is mid-1960s Holladay, so it's still relatively undeveloped. But isn't this a wonderful image? I just think it's great. Thank you. St. Vincent de Paul Church was constructed 12 years after the school that we looked at earlier. This doesn't look like any Catholic church, any traditional Catholic church I've ever seen. It was actually designed by a member of the congregation named Cecil Holland. What's most interesting to me about this, it's got a very distinctive shape to it, for sure. What's in some ways more interesting to me about this is the steeple, which is a completely separate architectural element from the building itself. I mentioned earlier the idea of clear story windows. These are windows that are above the floor, so to speak. They're not of the floor, so to speak. And I'm going to run over here. These are clear story windows, okay? They are above us. There could be clear story windows up here, right? And what they do is they project light into a building. Look at this. Can you imagine being in service and all of a sudden the sun comes out from behind the clouds and there you are. And it's almost eerie. It's a really beautiful design by Cecil Holland. This is one of the most famous churches in the universe. It is the Olympus Stake Center, constructed in the early 1960s. And again, my point here is not that this looks modernist as the modernist buildings that we looked at earlier. It's modernist because in my mind it's a contemporary interpretation of the ideals of this denomination, the LDS Church, and of this particular congregation. It's really interesting. People sometimes refer to it as the pagoda, and that's not a pejorative term. It's not meant to be a criticism. I think it speaks to the beauty of the design. But find yourself in the interior, in that lower image. It is literally uplifting. Those wonderful wood, graceful wood structural elements that rise up, those are laminated beams, which were highly popular as we got into the 60s and 70s and 80s. If I were in this congregation, you can tell, by the way, how attentive I was in church as a child. But if I were in this congregation, I would spend most of my time looking up. This is literally an uplifting design. It's absolutely beautiful. The architect was somebody named Lynn Pinniger, and I'm not familiar with that name, but he was with a firm called Jackson and Sharp. Richard Jackson is an architect of whose work I'm more familiar with. When was it built? Well, I have 1963. Does that sound about? Is anybody a member of this particular ward or state? No. Okay. Isn't it a great building? No, it's really beautiful. Okay, we're going to get to the punchline now. Residential modernism. And as I mentioned at the outset, I believe Holladay has more significant modernist homes than any other community in the state of Utah. And I don't even know how many there are. And we're going to come to that at the end. So, first of all, let's all lament the fact that we don't design cars like this anymore, right? It's just kind of a shame. But look at the setting that Mercury chose to promote this 1957 Mercury vehicle, Straight Out of Tomorrow. It is a modernist home. Straight lines, right angles, lots of glass. By the 1950s, modernism that for a while in the U.S. had been seen as kind of austere and kind of cold and distant was now seen as communicating sophistication and elegance. So you have now homeowners looking to modernist designs, looking to design buildings that are of this particular style. Thank you. So we talked about Mies van der Rohe. Mies van der Rohe, in my mind, was probably the most influential of the European architects who came out of this early period of modernism. This is the Farnsworth home in Illinois. Now you're thinking, wait a minute here, I came here to hear about Holladay, not about Illinois. But the reason I raise this or show this to you is we're going to see some other examples of homes that were designed along these ideas. But you can see here, this has all of those elements we've talked about, the expression of structure, steel beams, steel columns, lots of glass, this wonderful concrete walkway up into the entry. Apparently, if you read about this house, apparently Mies van der Rohe and his client, Mrs. Farnsworth, had a falling out. And one story says she actually refused to live in the home after it was completed. And you might look at this and go, not too sure about the privacy aspect of this thing, but it's out in the woods. I mean, if somebody's going to walk through the woods to see you walk around in your underwear, more power to them, I guess. I don't know. So here we have an example of how Mies van der Rohe influenced Utah architects. This is a home designed by Dean Gustafson. I mentioned John Sugden earlier. He and Dean Gustafson were partners. They were associates. And they were both, if you said on a scale of 1 to 10, how modernist are you as an architect? They would both be like 11s. Okay? They were really, truly into the modernist idiom, if you will. This home was constructed in 1960. You can see again, it's got the expression of structure, the steel columns and the beams, lots of glass. But what I want to point out in this image is really the lower image in the slide. Imagine yourself sitting in that black leather chair, reading a book. You are literally in your garden. One of the goals that modernists were striving for was what they called dematerialization. Okay, so we've got curvilinear, we've got rectilinear, and now we've got dematerialization. You can take those home. So your partner's going to say, what'd that guy talk about tonight? Well, he talked about rectilinearization, and that'll end the evening, I'm sure. But if you think about this, look at what they were trying to accomplish was to integrate inside and outside, to literally break down this barrier, to dematerialize the wall. So you have all of this glass here. I mean, imagine yourself just sitting there. I could sit there all day and just look out the window. Well, probably not, because my wife would have something to say about that. This home was designed by Edward Dreyer. He's probably the most inventive of our Utah modernist architects. This is one of his more conservative designs, very Miesian in its style. But again, if you look at the lower image, imagine yourself cooking dinner. I mean, there's a tree right there. There are probably deer running around the yard, birds flying around. It's absolutely very much in the landscape. The irony here is, though, look at the upper image. Modernists, at least these early designs, were not striving to be of the landscape. In fact, they were very conscious of being distinct from their setting. So there's a little bit of an irony in that to me, in that we're trying to kind of bring the outside in, but we don't really want to be part of it in a sense. This home was designed by Ron Molen, another great Utah architect. It's Miesian in its style, but it feels a little softer. So we're trying to kind of diminish this hard edge, this sort of industrial feeling design. You know, Mies van der Rohe's designs, I would say, feel almost industrial in nature. And so we're trying to kind of soften that a little bit. What's really important about this home is what you don't see, because the backside is full of glass. And it fronts a stream on the other side. It's really a wonderful design. I had a chance in a recent homes tour that we did in Holladay to be the house manager in this house. So it was kind of my house for the day. I thought that was pretty cool. Well, we have this evolution. We're moving now away from hard edge modernism to something that's a little kinder, gentler, a little softer. This home was designed by John Sugden, and it incorporates brick. Now, early modernists and sort of pure modernists, if you will, probably would not have used brick because, again, it had a texture. It didn't emphasize this kind of planar quality to the building. This is really neat. It's kind of hidden away. What's interesting to me is there are two houses on this property. There's this one, and there's one that's kind of like a sort of arts and crafts, very different kind of house. Yeah, Kim's looking at it. I don't remember. I remember when Kim and I communicated about this house, and she said, that's not there anymore, but I did drive by it. It is there. Thank you very much. Yeah. 40%. Thank you, Bill. Yeah. Okay. Okay. Hey, Bill. I'm kind of... Don't take over. Thank you for that. That was most helpful. So I ride my bike by this house. You know what? That's good, because I've saved you the embarrassment of having me knock on your door in my bike shorts and saying, do you know how cool your house is? Oh.
I found a realtor that wanted to sell to postmodern homes, and that's why it's so good.
It is absolutely, isn't that a spectacular home? It is absolutely beautiful. And I don't need to point this out, but you can see this wonderful roof line. It's often called a butterfly roof. The technical term is folded plate. What that means is there are these two plates that are joining in the middle. It's kind of almost isometric. They're working with and against one another. What that allows the architect to do is create what they call a clear span in the interior. It's like a large open space. So I'll have a question for you. Were there any supporting walls or anything inside this house, or was it pretty open on the edge?
No. So if you go straight in, there's a huge stone floating fireplace.
Wow.
With a bar going straight through the middle from the ceiling to the basement.
Wow.
That was out on that so 40 pieces, and it's half a living room. I can get you another.
Oh man, it's just this house, and you can see in the corner there's again natural materials. We're starting to incorporate more natural materials. We're starting to create this kinder, gentler form of modernism with the stone wall there, and this corner full of glass. I just think it's an absolutely beautiful. It's not a grand home. It's relatively small, but it is so spectacular. So I'm glad I didn't stop by and knock on the door in my bike shorts. That would have been a problem. Okay. This home was designed by Don Earl, and you can see again we're progressing now away from this kind of hard-edge industrial feel of museum modernism to something probably more amenable to the general market. And you can see this is an example again of abstraction, of pulling the house apart and putting it back together again. There are different boxes, architects would call these volumes, that are put together to create this composition. But there's a stone wall just to the left of the entry and a stone column. It's really wonderful, very naturalistic, and we're starting to see modernism become more naturalistic in its qualities. Yes? Don Earl. Yeah. You know, I got to say, I had a chance, by the way, I had a chance to interview architects who had practiced in Utah in the latter part of the 20th century. It's really one of the privileges of my career. And I had a chance to interview Don Earl, and what a gracious guy he was. He was really a wonderful person. But I always think he should have been the front guy for a country band. I don't know why. Just that name seems to be. So this home is an example, again, of how modernism has evolved. We're moving away. We still have geometric forms. We still have fairly simple shapes. This is an abstraction. There's a couple of wings to this house. But look at the lower image. Look at all of this glass. Look at, you know, you are outside in this house, really. You kind of live outside, even if you're indoors. It's really a wonderful home. It's really a beautiful composition with all of this great outside living space. It's very much a part of the design. But this is pretty far away now from those first two houses that we looked at, the Gustafson house and the Dreyer house. We're kind of moving pretty far away, even though the essential ingredients of modernism are here. And we've come to the end of this kind of progression. You know, I mentioned earlier that modernist architects initially, they didn't really worry about the building being of the site. You know, Frank Lloyd Wright once famously said, a building doesn't want to be on a hill, it wants to be of a hill. This building is very much of its site, and I want to read you a description of it from the Utah Center for Architecture's website. This residence, excuse me, for a physician, his wife, and 4 children, was designed to fit into a stand of mature conifers. The house to fit into a stand of mature conifers. Now we are fitting the building into the site. The house is composed of a series of pavilions, sited to miss the trees while in places bridging a small stream. Okay, who wants to live here? Right? I mean, does that sound beautiful or what? Yes, it is. It's on Walker Lane. Yeah, I'm reluctant to give specific addresses for privacy reasons, but it is on Walker Lane. Yes. Isn't that a beautiful house? You can see it's wood. Siding is wood. We have these wonderful shed roofs. That's that sloping roof. Very much so now of its site. But the basic elements of modernism are still there. Now we kind of come full circle because we have in Utah, in Holladay, a great example of the way that some builders were thinking about incorporating modernism into these more suburban styles. This is actually a home that was designed by Cliff May, a California architect who was one of the progenitors of the modern ranch house. But he was able to adapt that style and incorporate very modernist ideas. If you look at the upper image, this was part of the 1955 Parade of Homes, and that area of Holladay is now what? It's the first historic district in Holladay. So if you think buildings like that aren't historic, they are, for sure. But you can see Cliff May incorporated all of these windows in the upper image. You can see that. And really, perhaps more significant is what he did on the inside of these buildings with his open floor plan and how he created the sense of space and movement. Really, he really did some incredible designs. I want to finish our discussion of modernism by focusing on Stephen McDonald. Of all of our great modernist Utah architects, and we had a lot of them, he is probably the most significant. When I interviewed architects who practiced in Utah after World War II, I said, who influenced you? And his name came up as often as any other, as often as I.M. Pei, great American architect, Louis Kahn. It kind of surprised me because, to be frank with you, up until that point, I'd never heard of him. But you have in Holladay a number of Stephen McDonald homes. They are really extraordinary. And I think one of the reasons that he influenced other architects was he was so successful at combining these natural elements, wood and stone, but creating this much more comfortable feel to his houses. This is another house that is in the Lakewood district. Really, again, look at all the glass, in the backside, but look at the wonderful profile here.
When you enter this house, you have this kind of stepping back of this fascia here. It's kind of inviting you to come into the house. It's really a wonderful, subtle little
Design element. And I think that was one of his great qualities was there were these kind of elements that you could almost miss, And then you look again, you go, wow, that's really cool. This is probably the most, I think, significant Stephen McDonald home in Holladay. It is an absolute gem. It was purchased a few years ago, and those of us who are involved in preservation know that when a home goes up for sale, when any building goes up for sale, we hold our breath. But the person who bought this home absolutely loves it, and he plans to restore it. But you can see this home is very much of the landscape, in part because Stephen McDonald uses these natural materials to such a great extent. It's got stone walls, it's got wood, lots of glass. It really is a beautiful composition. One of the really cool aspects of this house is the back side, because you see all of that glass on the back side. And I want to read you from an essay that Stephen McDonald wrote in the mid-1950s about his philosophy of design. One thing is certain. There is a serious need to examine the present set of conditions to determine whether or not our emotional and social needs are being satisfied. Present structures have become so box-like in room concept, so confining in their relation to surrounding gardens, that personal imaginative expression by the inhabitants is retarded. In other words, we're just closed in. And Stephen McDonald wanted to open us up to our surroundings, to the gardens around us. I've got to point this out.
So we talked about bringing the outside into the house, right? Here's a fence that separates this house from the house next door. There's a doorway on the other side of this fence. Stephen McDonald brought the fence into the house. It comes into the house. Isn't that cool? I mean, he literally brought the outside in.
What a wonderful, you might not even notice that necessarily, but what a wonderful device that he incorporated in the design of this house.
Are those concrete floors?
They are concrete floors, yeah. I showed this to my wife, and, of course, one of my spouses approved. I'm sorry, we don't really need to go into that. And I showed this to my wife. She's like, that feels a little cold to me. So I can see that, the concrete floors, and there's other elements of this house that are really spectacular. It's not a large house, it's not grand, but it certainly is beautiful. And I wanted to show you this building. Anybody know what this is? What can you? It's the Sandpiper. She wins. She wins. It is. It's the Sandpiper. This is the first phase of the Sandpiper Apartments. I had no idea this existed, but I was driving up Spring Lane, and I ran across this building, which is modernist to the core, straight lines, right angles, industrial materials, really a beautiful design. And then you walk out your front door and you're in a garden. So this is, again, that evolution of incorporating the landscape in the design of the building and incorporating the building into the landscape. All right, we're just about done. How's everybody doing? You doing all right? Okay. So I'm going to talk about what it means. In my mind, as a student of architecture, architecture defines community character. Holladay is defined by its buildings. And you might say, what about the people? Yeah, the people are important too. But to somebody who comes from outside, when I drive through Holladay, what I see are its buildings. And that's the defining element of the community. And because so much of Holladay's architecture was constructed after World War II, post-war architecture is a defining element of Holladay's community character. I would say Holladay has an extraordinary inventory of suburban architectural types and styles. We looked at a couple, primarily the modern ranch house. There are lots of variations on that type. And we're going to get in a minute to perhaps the most significant point of the evening, but we need to know what those are. And as I mentioned earlier, Holladay has a greater concentration of significant modernist houses, I believe, than any other community in Utah. I drove through Holladay both in my car and on my computer. And as I was driving around Holladay, I kept stopping. Fortunately, most of the time I was on my computer. But I kept stopping because I would see another house that clearly was designed, and it was a modernist house. I just didn't know anything about it. There's a lot of that out there. And that gets to a point I'm going to make in just a minute. Holladay has more than its share of works by significant post-war Utah architects. Here's a list, and it is not exhaustive because I really don't know what's out there, the entirety of what's out there. But these architects are significant, and they design buildings in Holladay, not just homes, but schools, commercial buildings. You should be really proud of this asset. You should celebrate it. But Holladay is losing its post-war architecture. We talked about the Regus Medicus, that wonderful, beautiful sort of geometric building designed by John Sugden. That's gone. Tracy Collins, the little Tracy Collins building we looked at, it's now, it's where the, when I walked down to Layla to have dinner, I walked by where that little strip mall where Crown Burger is. That's where the Tracy Collins is sort of the end building on that strip, or was the end building on that strip mall. It's been heavily modified. Success Market Building is gone. Codwin Mall, of course, is gone. Olympus High School is gone. The Holladay Library, as I said, has been heavily modified. And I believe the modifications actually compromised the integrity of the building, the architectural integrity. And then there's the building down below. Anybody know what that building is? Okay, you can't answer because you know. Okay, anybody else? No. Okay, David, go ahead. That's the original Cottonwood Club. Now, I cannot second guess or criticize the decision of club members, but all I can say is the loss of this building is extraordinary. It's absolutely not only because it's a spectacular building. This is a crappy image. This is an image from an old newspaper. Imagine if we had a high-quality image of this building. But the other reason that this loss is really compelling to me is that it was designed by Stephen McDonald. So we're losing a lot of significant architecture. We're also losing buildings like this. I was riding my bike through Holladay today, and I managed to come home alive. And I ran across a vacant lot, recently made vacant, that had formerly been occupied by this building. And my point is this: we're coming back to this issue of what is significant, what's important in Holladay's architectural evolution. It's buildings like this. They are the suburban buildings of Holladay's post-war character. But this home is not there anymore. So what happens? This is not Holladay. And I deliberately chose a not Holladay picture because I didn't want to put anybody on the spot. Okay? I want to sort of be thoughtful about the fact that people make choices. I may not agree with them, but they are their choices. However, here's the issue. This is actually in Salt Lake County. I will say that. If you look at the building on the left, that is your, typical post-war, early post-war Holladay house, right? Holladay home. The building on the right has absolutely nothing to do with it. And my point is this: community character is fragile. It doesn't take much to really compromise community character, to compromise the architectural integrity of a neighborhood or of an entire community. And this is the kind of thing, and the reason I put this up here, I wasn't intending to talk to this kind of point when I started my research, but as I drove around Holladay, I saw a lot of this going on. And it concerns me quite a bit. So I have a couple of recommendations, and then I'm happy to open the floor for any kinds of conversation, questions. If they're particularly challenging, I will toss them over to Kim. So the first one is to understand what you have. I'll say this has been one of the most challenging presentations I've ever had because there's so little information about Holladay architecture. It's really hard to find. So you as a community, I challenge you to know what you have, to inventory what you have. And I'm going to define that by showing you the next slide, and I'll come to the second point in a minute. So this is a map that I generated from a database that is maintained by the Utah State Historic Preservation Office of buildings that have been surveyed to determine their architectural status. And I'm going to walk over with you.
This blue line is the boundary between Holladay on the right and Murray on the left. Every green or red dot represents a building that has been surveyed, that has been inventoried. We know what it is. Look at the density of dots in Murray. And look at the lack of density of dots in Holladay.
Who did that survey then?
Well, there are various surveys. These would be various surveys. I'm sure that these, Murray did these over time. I would be stunned if they did all of this in one survey. So part of the challenge here is to do these surveys. It's going to take some time. But we got to start somewhere. And the reason I am so stringent, strident about this, I guess, is that if you don't know what you have, it's too easy to lose it. You know, if community character is fragile and you really don't know what you have, it's really easy to lose it. So the first thing I would say is know what you have. And I'm going to... Using crops, would they bonus for that? Okay? Kim was kind enough to loan this to me. The most recently published, I believe, is this one. And it was published, the second printing was 1987. That means this, and so the first printing was in the 70s. That means this history of Holladay is now 50 years, basically 50 years old. The other thing is, some of the images that I showed you, especially early on, are years that not the building looked at. They're in these histories, but guess what? As far as I can tell, they're all in private collections.
So I would really encourage Holladay to start developing a repository of its architectural information. Get photos, get documents, get materials, get that Granite School District history so you know what you have. Because again, if you don't know what you have, it's too easy to lose it. So I ran across a kind of a dissonance in my research. When I looked at the general plan for Holladay and I looked at a recent community survey, what they said to me was that, in fact, the general plan has a section called neighborhood preservation. And in the recent community survey, neighborhoods and development were identified as significant issues to the community. But if I take you back to that slide of the little house with the big house next to it that we looked at about 3 slides ago, I see that happening in Holladay. So what I see going on in Holladay doesn't to me seem to reflect what's articulated in the general plan and the community survey. There's a kind of a dissonance there in my mind. I don't know what that's about, but it's a concern. And I think I would say you need to focus on preserving community character because it's about who you have been, obviously. It's also about who you are now, but more importantly, it's about who you want to be in the future. So with that, I'm happy to open the floor for a conversation. Yes, Kim.
I want to play the devil's advocate and say, who cares? Who cares about the community character? Who cares if it all disappears in the next 20 years? Then we have a different looking city.
Right. Well, the community of Holladay appears to care because it's in the general plan, it's in the community survey. So that's what I'm saying. I'm not quite clear on why what's going on in the community seems to be very different than what I see in the community vision, so to speak, as articulated. But, let's say everybody in Holladay showed up in this room. First of all, it would be a lot warmer than it is right now. But the other thing is, if we said, hey, do you guys really care about what happens here architecturally? And 90% of the people said, nah, I would say that's a valid community choice. If it truly is a community choice. It's not one I would agree with personally, but I would say it's valid. But I don't believe that's what Holladay has articulated for itself. I don't believe it has articulated a sort of laissez-faire development attitude. Other questions or comments? Let me go to her first, David, if you would, and then I'll come to you.
The neighborhood we live in is built just post-war. I think our house is 55, and there's some that are older. And they're mostly, you know, brick houses. They all have a kind of a similar post-war look. And the few streets that we live in, they're funny little houses that had no interior walls. They put frames up and put the walls in, and theoretically you could then move those walls.
Huh.
So and they've got lots of little places to save things and put them, but there's not a single wall except the bathroom that they still have the old wire that furnishes electricity to the place.
Huh.
So it's only a few streets, and they're little modest houses. And as we learned the history, we've only been in ours for about 5 or 6 years, but people raised 3 or 4 or 5 children in these tiny houses.
Yeah.
And what we're always afraid of every time one comes up for sale is, well, you know, some have already been just knocked down.
Yeah.
We can't make a law against it, but they're a significant little try for something unusual.
Yeah. Did you hear her comment about her house? She grew up in it, or not grew up, she lives in a house that's relatively small, kind of brick house, post-war house, that had no interior walls to it. So you could theoretically move the walls around it. I was interested, you expressed some concern about several of these homes have been demolished. And then I was particularly interested in your next remark, which you said, you know, you can't really do anything about that. And the answer is absolutely you can. Yeah, it's a question of what the community attitude is. You know, there are plenty of communities that have significant demolition ordinances. Actually, Holladay has a demolition ordinance. It applies to what are defined as historic sites. There are 4 historic sites that are identified under that ordinance. I think there are a lot more in Holladay than that. So, yes, you can do something about it. It's really a question of, and I understand, you know, there's a reservation about infringing on property rights. I get that. It's a very Utah attitude. But the reality is property rights are not just about me. They're about everybody. And so you have to come to a collective decision as to what your priorities are. But you most definitely, I'm not saying the community of Holladay most definitely could do something about it if it really desired to do so. David, you got a comment?
Just to piggyback on that first historic district, national, maybe you could talk about the difference between local designation and national designation. But that was put into place because the neighborhood was afraid of warehouses.
That's our national.
Yeah.
Well, we're just adjacent, yeah. We're not in, ours are much smaller, more modest district, but it's a walk. It's just a short walk.
With movable walls?
Oh, no, I don't have any idea. And they're just like, they don't get it's really funny.
Well, I'm gonna gloat a little bit because that makes my point, right? We don't know what we have. So I'm just taking, okay. David asked me to clarify a distinction between national historic districts and local historic districts.
If I could just add one more
Yeah.
thing on that. Maybe you could explain the role of CLGs.
Yeah.
And how that survey was funded.
Yeah, okay.
Sorry, I'm down, could you also just talk a little bit about, my home is on the National Historic Registry.
Yeah.
So I'm curious, what's the distinction between like going to the state versus the things that the city feel, you know, like no free,
Yeah.
no free.
Yeah.
Probably knows nothing about my house, it was done to the state, to get it from the National Registry. I don't understand exactly the
Okay.
layers of the city.
Okay. All right, let's all take a deep breath while watching this. Okay. So, I'll start with the National Register of Historic Places. The National Register of Historic Places is an honorific designation. What that means is that it does not carry any regulatory authority with it. There's no federal law, no state law, there's no local law that comes with designation on the National Register of Historic Places. What there is, though, there are tax credits that are available to property owners who own homes that are on the National Register of Historic Places. If your house is in a historic district, like the Lakewood Historic District, and has a certain designation within that district, you also might be eligible for those tax credits. Along with that, there's been extensive research done by Donovan Ripkema, who is the national expert on the economics of historic preservation, that demonstrates that houses in historic districts, that the market value of houses in historic districts increases at a much greater rate than the market value of comparable houses that are not in historic districts. In other words, if your house is in a historic district and you want to sell it, it's going to have more value than if it weren't in a historic district. Local historic districts are a different animal because they often can carry certain regulatory limitations with them. It's really up, I think the real sort of the bottom line on this is that it's up to the community to determine how much regulation you want to bring to these important places. If you don't care, as Kim said, what if we just don't care? Well, if you just don't care, okay. But if you care, then the community can bring regulations to bear on buildings and sites that it considers to be significant. Did you want to add anything to that?
That's great. I think that also in terms of national and or local, you have identified the story. You've registered that story through an official body, whether it's the federal government. And, in a planning meeting, if you go and say this house is historic and it's unregistered, or if that officialdom hasn't, sort of weighed down on the history and, said this is important, 9 times out of 10 you're going to lose that resource.
Yeah.
It's the difference between, going to college and skipping, class on the last day and not graduating.
Been there, done that, yeah.
Just continuing on to get that diploma.
Yeah.
That official recognition, but then so often saves the day. And the process makes people aware of what's there.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. If you didn't hear what David was saying, the process of designating a building on the National Register is valuable because you learn a lot about the building, but also because it gives it a certain status. Even if it's not protected per se, just that status, the status of being on the National Register can carry weight if you're trying to preserve a building. Yes, Kim?
Another issue that I run into in the last couple of years is that people think that there's some kind of entity out there that's, what you talked about is a survey. Not very many people know about that, but I feel like there's some kind of entity out there who's noticing these historic buildings, they're cataloging them, they're photographing them. There is no such entity. If you have a cool home in Holladay, you better be responsible for doing something about that, either getting on the register or contacting the state office, because there's not a group of people out there that are like waiting to do something about your house. You have to advocate for it yourself.
Yeah. Well, I would partially disagree with that. Okay, and it kind of gets to David's second point about what are called CLGs. CLG is an acronym. You can take that one home with you too. So we got rectilinear, curvilinear, dematerialization, and CLG. So if you get home and your spouse, your partner wants to keep you up for a while, just throw those out and you'll end the evening right there. The CLG is an acronym for Certified Local Government, and I believe it's Holladay's Historical Commission. So what that means is that the State Historic Preservation Office receives funds from the federal government, and it is authorized to distribute those funds as grants to local CLGs. There are a bunch of them around the state. They're usually the local historic commission. Those funds can be used for preservation-related activities, including conducting surveys. So that's where I would partially disagree with you, because you could, through the CLG and Holladay, you could apply for a grant to do a survey of Holladay architecture. Now, you'd have to define it a little bit, maybe geographically, maybe in terms of the types or styles of buildings that you want to look at, but that's the starting point for getting this inventory. It might be, I don't know for sure, I don't run the CLG program, so I can make any kind of promises I want, but it might be that gathering all the documentation, as I talked about, sort of getting a repository of Holladay architectural information together, that might be eligible for a CLG grant as well. So, but, you know, it doesn't mean that you as a property owner shouldn't do something on your own. I'm going to look right at Adrienne and remind you of her business, House Genealogy. She can help you with that research. She can do the research for you and tell you what your house is and what it means and who lived there. And I've done that kind of research myself for Preservation Utah, and I can't even begin to tell you how cool it is. You know, it's just really cool. Other questions or comments? Yes?
Are you doing other neighborhoods in the area?
Am I doing presentations like this? I think my credibility this evening has pretty well been dashed, so I don't have anywhere to go from it. No, I'll do these when people ask me to do them, so I don't have any on the schedule right now. I will say this though, and I'm going to take the opportunity to hijack your question and remind you of the Historic Homes Tour on Saturday in Federal Heights. You can go to the Preservation Utah website and register there. You can also pay day of. It's in Federal Heights, and I, with Adrienne and I did the research on the homes there. There are some really cool homes on that tour. It's really an amazing tour. But in direct answer to your question, right now, no, I don't have anything on the agenda related to that. No, no more neighborhood presentations for the time being. Yes.
So in a community like Holladay, you have a problem that you don't really have a continuous history. And then you talk about designating houses. The problem becomes, what's worthy of designation? I've spent a lot of time going to homes in the Avenues. My father was in a home in the Avenues. It was beautiful, but there's a lot of homes that are really country inside. There's not a lot of homes.
Yeah.
A lot of the visual needs to ripped out.
Yeah.
In the 1970s, construction grade things. And there's beautiful mid-century homes in Holladay as well. There's also homes that are built just for expediency and for economy.
Yeah.
And so I think you mentioned earlier in your remarks, defining what's worth saving is especially difficult here. We got Federal Heights. Okay, now I got a job.
Right.
Now I've got homes that are built in a certain era for the most part.
Yeah.
You don't have it. You know, this is never really hang on it. That's an extremely difficult thing to do, and especially come to terms with the community. That's a beautiful mid-century home. You should keep that. That's a home that's, you know, a split entry, you know, built for $15,000.
Yeah. Well, so there's a whole bunch in that comment, and one of the my immediate response to the end of your comment was, you said, well, it was just a $15,000 home, you know, and I understand that attitude. You know, the bungalows that are so precious in Sugar House, that was the $15,000 home of its period, and they are now precious. So, yeah, but.
And then to your point, you brought up, you know, pre-World War II versus post-World War II, there's a different aesthetic to it. And to your point, when you're looking at it, there is some good value in that. The aesthetic is markedly different. The home built in 1910s.
I agree with that. Unfortunately, determining whether a building is significant or not is not about aesthetics. And that's really a critical thing to keep in mind. I served on a committee for the State Historic Preservation Office that reviewed nominations to the National Register of Historic Places. And every once in a while, we'd look at a nomination and we'd look at a house or something and go, yeah, you know, that doesn't look all that great. Well, that was the end of that. That was, you know, okay. But that's not part of the decision-making process here. There are different criteria for determining whether a building is significant, other than whether it has some aesthetic value to anybody in particular. And that's part, and I think that's actually part of your comment that makes, I agree with you, it's particularly challenging because a lot of these houses in Holladay, they don't carry that kind of wonderful aesthetic quality. They don't look like a bungalow. They don't look like a period revival home. But that doesn't make them potentially any less significant because it's not really about what they look like necessarily aesthetically. It's about what they represent architecturally or what they represent historically.
I think it's about the point that as you expand your criteria and definition, now you get to the point where everything becomes special, and then everything becomes special. And then the very intent of the discussions, I want to preserve these homes from the community. Now you hit so much, you're not selective in the definition, you're not selective in the choice, that you've lost the ability to accomplish what you want to do as all of it.
Yeah.
Nothing else, aesthetics are not the only guideline. Fair enough, but what is the guidelines outside of aesthetics that are going to capture the community spirit and interest? I don't know what that is.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I agree with that comment. I think you have to be careful. You know, you can't, not everything can be significant. And you're right. You know, and sometimes there can be it's kind of a fine line in making that determination, especially with the kind of architecture that we're talking about here in a lot of cases, like those two first post-war houses that we looked at. Very simple, kind of like the house you live in now, probably. Kind of simple, not ornate, not grand. Well, there are quite a few of those houses in Holladay. Are they all significant, or do they all represent a particular type of architecture that is significant? Or were they constructed by developers whose work was considered significant? I agree with your point. I mean, we have to be careful. That's one reason that we hire experts to do the surveys, because they're the ones who have the experience and the expertise to make that cut, to say, this one doesn't qualify and this one does. I'm going to come to you in just a sec. I want to come to you over here, and I'll come back to you.
Well, I was just going to add to what you were saying. I think you have to kind of keep the sensibility of the neighborhood.
Yeah.
I live in a neighborhood that's very slow. All the houses kind of go down so that nobody's house is sticking up higher.
Right.
It kind of kept a good elevation line. But then someone tore down their house next to me and added a whole story. So there's our slope and that house. And
Yeah. Yeah.
Everyone's a view of the people looking at the mountains. And
Yeah.
people across the street move.
Yeah.
So I think you need to really be a part of the neighborhood and consider the sensibility of the neighborhood and not try to drastically change what that personality of the neighborhood is.
Yeah, here's another word you can take home with you. Compatibility. I mean, that's the word that those of us who are involved in preservation throw around a lot. Is a building compatible, whether it's being remodeled? You know, the Holladay Library, again, I believe that the remodel of the Holladay Library was incompatible with the original design of the building. But you can have compatible, what's called infill, where you build a new building in a vacant lot. You can have a compatible remodel. But those are issues that the community has to grapple with. I don't believe that those are issues that the community has explicitly grappled with. And if it has, then they're not being implemented out on the ground, so to speak. You had a comment here.
Yeah, well, just coming back to I'm curious your thoughts on the history of the National Historic Registry, you know, the three criteria for determining a building's historical significance. Is that the kind of thing that you think would be useful in a community like this as far, or is that just something that you think more applies to that registry generally versus determining historic buildings outside of the national?
Well, the criteria that are used to determine a building's eligibility for there are actually 4 criteria. There are 2 that are most commonly applied. One is whether a building is architecturally significant, and the other is whether it's historically significant. And there's more detail to those 2 criteria. They're not quite that general. But those criteria would apply anywhere you were looking at a historic or a potentially historic building, or significant building, I should say. So they apply in Holladay, they apply in Murray, they apply in Sugar House. I think that's what your question was getting at.
Well, I guess I'm just saying, when Tom's thinking through, you know, which buildings in Holladay are worth saving, maybe it's not the 200 split level that they compared to, you know, is this one particularly significant for some reason because maybe it was the first split level home, or
right.
this was a home that a significant person lived in.
Yep, you got it.
Developer, or, you know, there's criteria.
Yeah.
Category that can help and distinguish the difference between one and three. You know, obviously, not every single home is going to be safe.
Right. Well, you just articulated how the surveys are conducted. I mean, that's what the surveyors look at. They look at, you know, when was the building built, and when they do the research behind it, that's one reason the Lakewood District was designated, because many of those homes were significant. There were a number of homes in there that were designed by Steve McDonald, for example. There's a Cliff May home there. Those houses individually would be considered significant. but you just articulated the rationale behind a lot of this, which is, what do you look at? Well, was this house the first of its kind in Holladay? Is it the last of its kind in Holladay? Was it, constructed by a particular developer who's significant in the history of the community? Those kinds of questions are the questions that we would look at. Yeah, David.
Well, the interesting thing about the Lakewood is that the historic district really just blends in with the rest of the neighborhood.
Yeah.
You would drive through it, for a million years, not understanding its significance, but it was doing that research, surveys, finding the story of these were all homes that were presented in the 1956 grade homes, which was something that was invented here in Salt Lake. And then the story started to roll, and then suddenly you had a story that was worthy to tell and actually register on the National Register of Historic Places.
Right.
It's really about that story and finding out enough information about the building in question to start that process rolling.
In fact,
That was a resident that started that follow-up, right, Diane?
Yeah, she didn't know the history of her neighborhood. She was concerned that her next door neighbor was tearing down her house.
But she became engaged. And they did destroy that one house.
yeah. And that I kind of want to respond to you again, because that raises the point. When I was on the committee, and we were at that review committee, and we looked at that nomination for the Lakewood district, and I remember looking at a few homes going, nah. But when I read about them and what made them significant, I realized, yes, they deserve to be included in the designation of the district. So it can be a fairly complex process, I will acknowledge, and it's not entirely, also sometimes not entirely clear what might distinguish one building from another just at face value. And that's why it's so important to do this inventory, to do the research, to really understand what you have. Oh, yeah, Jay, yep.
So fantastic.
Thank you, thank you.
I'm trying to figure out, did you approach the city and say, hey, I would love to do a presentation on modernism or what have you? I'm just trying to figure out the pieces.
Kim contacted me and told me that she would set my house on fire if I didn't give a presentation. Yeah.
So, yeah, I have no idea who you are.
I'm the vice chair of the Holladay Historic Committee and Commission, and this is the seventh election we've had, and I've chosen, it's every other one, so I've chosen scholars to come in to the community, Alan Roberts, David M., people who know a lot like this, and they're coming to the community and drive around, and then they go and do all this research so they can come here and tell us what we have here, because nobody else is doing that.
So I'm assuming you live in Holladay.
I do.
So are residents coming to you and saying, hey, we talked about that, or?
No, really what happens is when a house is about to get torn down, there'll be a big foment. And people will say, why is the Holladay Historic Commission do something about that? We're a group of a handful of volunteers that have no authority over anything that goes on. We're just trying to create some kind of community awareness that if you care about this, then come and get involved with us.
Yeah.
You know that? You do?
Their house was in the presentation, but I won't tell you which it was. But I will tell you this, it's a spectacular house. Yeah. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah. Yes?
I'm curious, do you know, those of you on the board, well, are there other, like with Murray, the Mill Creek, the neighboring communities, do they have a similar,
David can talk to that. Mill Creek does.
Yeah, that's right, from the Creek. The historic commissions or CLGs around the state operate on a sort of a gradient of functional to dysfunctional. And so I would just encourage whatever city you live in is eligible to have a historic commission. And if you don't have a city with a historic commission or a functional historic commission, get involved and kind of change that. Get to know your city's ordinance regarding historic preservation. Some cities have great ordinances that protect properties, and other cities you know, might as well not have anything, because what they do have on the books is, you know, as weak as you know, water sewer. So, yeah, it's just sort of this tapestry of, you know, each municipality has their own sets of rules, commissions, and things like that. And, you know, there's a lot of room in Utah, I think, generally, to do more with preservation. And every city, I think, would welcome additional hands to help, even the most highly functioning historic commissions. Very much need good people to step up and help carry the load. You know, in Holladay, if you don't mind me talking about it, you know, there is an idea to create new historic preservation ordinances that actually protect properties and acknowledge properties that, you know, tell stories that extend beyond the 19th century. All four of those houses, which are barely protected, that are listed in the Holladay ordinance, and I don't think any of them are past 1905. And when you drive through this community, you don't feel like you're in a community that only represents 1905 or before.
Yeah.
That's not the nature of Holladay.
Yeah.
So there's just a whole lot of room to get involved here in Mill Creek, any city.
Do you live in Mill Creek? Yeah. So, you know, check it out. I mean, check out the Historic Preservation Commission there. Most of these groups, unfortunately, are advisory. We all know what that word means, right? And so it would be nice if they had more teeth, so to speak, because their role is often discounted, to be frank, by local government. And that's why it's so critical for people to get involved. You know, bring more energy to the issues involved.
I don't think that was a group, but they definitely need more hands. It was the demolition of the old meeting house. We thought that group up going.
Yeah.
So.
Is there any synergy with the architectural community, association of architects or anything that could help with the historical preservation and what they decided?
Well, you can have more people like me come out for sure and talk about architecture. You can, again, conducting the inventory is really critical, and you could have a report as a result of the inventory. You know, there are people, my friend Kirk Huffaker, who does a lot of this research, Coral Pershinsky, Adrian, you know, these people know their stuff. I'm not an architect, you know. You're thinking, well, you should have told me that before you started talking tonight. But I'm not an architect. I've learned this stuff. So there are people from other disciplines who can come in and share that same kind of information and knowledge with you and really enrich what you know about the community. Yeah. Other comments, questions? Yes, Evan.
I asked this, I lived in this partially, but I'm thinking about it for most of your talk. We're talking about houses and people who live in them. But it's not static, those houses get traded.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
I'm wondering what role in addressing historic issues can realtors play, or are they playing? Are there realtors that specialize in historic homes?
So, when my mom passed away, and our home, which was architecturally designed by my uncle, who was the architect, and the only one in the neighborhood that is, and my brother didn't care. He just wanted to get it sold before Christmas. And I said, Dylan, if you let me take care of that, I'll find a realtor that cares about mid-century modern homes. And so they specifically found a young couple that wanted the home so that it would be purchased and not knocked down. So it depends on the realtor. At least there are a few, at least two I know from mid-century modern.
That's what I was getting at. And it seems to me that, you know, educating realtors might be as important as educating homes.
I think it's a great point, yeah, because the realtors may not know the value of the home, so to speak. I mean, they may obviously know the market value, but I know there is a firm out of Salt Lake called City Home Collective that specializes in mid-century architecture. Yeah, and they don't do just sort of the high-end kind of modernist, you know, buildings that we looked at. They do, you know, the modern ranch houses. They carry it all. There's another realtor in Salt Lake named Babs DeLay who is specialized in historic homes as well. But you're right. I mean, realtors should be aware of what's going on here. You know, theoretically, if you're a realtor and you're asked to sell the Dean Gustafson home that we looked at, the first modernist home that we looked at, then that was you. Yeah. Well, tell us what. Yeah. Well, with that person had to be crazy. I mean, really. Well, tell us about your experience, though. Tell us what Virginia, tell us how you dealt with that house and how you approached selling it.
I found out it was free from the owner, and so I actually was a city home, but at the time I was with Windermere, who was in that round building, by the way.
Yeah.
Anyway, so I just worked closely with the owners and found out that maybe they had free from the previous listing agent, actually, who was money tied is another really great.
Yeah, you're right.
And which house was it that we saw?
Dean Gustafson, it's on Hedgewood, it's the last one.
It's the first one that we looked at, or there's actually those they're sort of partner houses there. They're kind of the same.
No, I represented it.
Yeah. You know what that means?
We went in one.
Yes, we did. Yeah. And what that makes me think maybe another sort of approach to what you're suggesting, Evan, is to, for example, the Historical Commission could start to develop a roster of architects who are comfortable with and sympathetic to these designs and this type of architecture. And so when somebody wants to sell their house, you could say, hey, can we suggest that Monty Tai or you? Actually, we should probably start with you, right? It's your commission that we're talking about. But, yeah. Well, maybe the Historical Commission could do that. It's not an authority issue. It's simply an issue of information. Saying, if you're thinking about selling your house, we have this roster of these of these realtors who will sell your house and sell it to somebody who really wants to maintain. It's just an informational thing. It's not, you're not directing anybody, but they can still make their choice to go with somebody else.
Dean Gustafson built a little house for his mom that was kind of a model of his. It's right on Highland Drive, and someone bought it. It's interesting. But they did a reasonable, they did a pretty good job of this thing.
Yeah. We were driving by that house one day, and we were getting out of the car and starting to take pictures, and the homeowner came back, and she was very gracious, because I wouldn't have been so gracious. I would have, what the hell are you doing? But she was really nice. Yeah. There was another comment somewhere out here. Maybe not. Oh, yeah, Evan.
I have a closing comment. Another word for your list, unity.
Yeah.
Because it comes up in almost every aspect of the discussion.
Yeah.
That's really what it's about.
Yeah.
You're not going to achieve anything in this problem if you don't have a sense of unity.
I agree, absolutely. And that's, and it gets back, so I get the last word, I guess, because I have the microphone, but I agree. And I think to understand what your community is, you really have to go back and do this survey inventory process and really understand what you have architecturally, because otherwise it's just kind of out there. So, well, thank you. You put up, wow, my wife doesn't put up for this long, so, yeah.
And I also want to thank Holly Smith,
Well, yeah.
who comes to all of these meetings and takes care of all the AV, and we do you also help her.
Think about spending the whole evening having me jab this remote at you and saying, next.
So you were particularly on